No matter how you choose your signals, how you weight the signals, or how you gather up the signals, the moment you start adding up your data points, you have a fundamentally failed system that will utterly, massively overestimate the likelihood that a lead is ready for sales. And we're back.
How are you doing, Dale?
Doing well. How are you doing, Liam?
I am doing very well. Much better than yesterday, where if we'd been doing this yesterday, it would have been a problem because Comcast was out and I lost internet every hour from 9 in the morning until 2 o'clock in the morning, according to them, when they fixed it. So it was a general write-off of it. I was on a live event and it cut off right in the middle.
Oh, geez.
Different day, thankfully. But I'm excited for today. We have a topic that is near and dear to my heart. And I want to jump right into it because I have a lot of empathy for this topic. I said this in my post promoting this, but I spent many years building lead scoring with what I thought was the best of intentions. And I made some of the classic terrible mistakes, admittedly, for a long time. And I also tried different variations. I feel like I tried to come at this problem in as many different ways as possible. Instead of just looking at, which type of asset is worth more, I was looking at how recently did they engage with the asset, how broadly, a lot of the ABM stuff has been, how many different people from that organization have done it. And I tried all different variations, but I never really questioned, I think, the underlying model and the theory of what this all was for. And I think at the end of the day, it was always still the same idea. Get more points, more is better, and eventually more hits a point where it's enough. And I think that's really what it came back to. And so I kind of want to start there of let's take a step back and just address why this framework is so fundamentally flawed.
Well, and more fundamentally here too, I mean, the larger issue of the MQL and why the MQL has failed, what's the future of the MQL. The central problem with the MQL is the lead scoring. And every single replacement, suggestion for a replacement, marketing qualified accounts, marketing qualified organization or opportunity, AI qualified leads, every single suggestion for how we would replace the MQL keeps the exact same lead scoring mechanism in place and just tweaks it, but doesn't fundamentally alter it. And the problem with the MQL is the lead scoring. And if you cannot understand what the lead scoring problem is, you cannot understand why the MQL has failed. And, and let's define what we mean by the MQL has failed. Nobody in sales ever says, these leads are all absolutely great and ready to go to market. We just don't have enough people to keep up with you guys over in marketing. What they say is 95% of these leads are worthless. They have no idea that who we are. They don't know. They're not in market. They're not buying. And in fact, if you look at the very long running Gartner B2B benchmark reports they put out every year, one of the things they look at is the kind of industry benchmarks for conversion through the sales funnel. And what you've seen for years and years is that around 5 or 6% of MQLs that are supposedly marketing qualified and sales ready, only about 5 to 6% of MQLs are ever actually accepted by sales. That they become an active sales opportunity, worked by an AE. And that's a pretty astonishing failure rate. And what that means is that the underlying scoring mechanism is massively overestimating how ready people are. Not by 5 or 10%, but literally by a factor of 20. So there's something fundamentally flawed that's causing the lead scoring system to look at a very large number of unqualified leads and declare them to be qualified. And from a statistics standpoint, this is called a false positive problem, meaning, if you give a test, there are 2 false outcomes. There are false negatives, meaning in this case, was the lead actually sales ready, but we didn't qualify it as sales ready, and so sales missed it. Versus false positive, which is we took a lead that was not ready to, they were not in market, they were not sales ready, but we declared them to be and passed it over to sales. And that's the problem we've got here, is an just insanely high false positive rate. And, and the way to think about this is, if you go into the doctor and they, run you through a battery of tests and they say, you have cancer, we have a 5% probability that this test is correct. There's a 95% chance that we're wrong, but, which would be good news if it's cancer. But the deal is that wouldn't be a very good test. If it gets, for every 20 people that the test said you have cancer, 19 of them don't, you now have panicked a lot of people. And a test like that would not be allowed onto the market by the Federal Drug Administration. And yet, this is what we've done for 20 years with MQLs and lead scoring.
And I think that there's two things I think of with that. I think the first is that we're very, very good at forgetting the 95% of them that keep on failing. As soon as one comes in, we go, okay, so the model can't be that bad. We're at least getting some of the right people in. And then we kind of go down the narrative that I've heard from sales leaders as well, where they go, well, maybe it's not the best method of finding people, but we at least find people in the noise, and therefore get me loads of leads and I'll accept if lots of them are junk, as long as we can kind of power through it with volume-based activity. So we kind of wash away whether or not we did a good job. And we also don't really do a very intellectually honest job of saying, did we get lucky? Was it chance? Like, would we have done a better job if we just randomly picked names and called them and hoped that they were equally as good as the ones we qualified?
Right. And, the other thing that is interesting is there's an entire new arm of pretty much every B2B sales department that did not exist 25 years ago. And that's the BDRs. And the BDRs exist to sift through the giant pile of garbage that is the MQL leads. They get dumped over on sales, and they're like garbage pickers. They're going through this giant landfill, picking through it, hoping to find, a nugget of something of value. And so the mere fact that an entire section, an entire new organizational arm had to be stood up to defend sales from the MQL should say something about the quality of the MQLs and the quality of the lead scoring, which is at the heart of it. And to just do kind of a quick review, what's the classic way that MQLs have always been done, or lead scoring has always been done? And, a great place to look is, the egregiously bad practices that are promulgated by HubSpot. You can always count on HubSpot to just be clueless. And they do not fail when it comes to lead scoring. So they have this whole elaborate lead scoring framework built into the HubSpot environment. And it's pretty much the classic. So the idea is you have a list of signals, and so, this can be clicks, downloads, page visits, things like hiring events or funding events can be in there. And then once you set, lay down these events or these signals, you then basically pull a number out of thin air to guess how important it is. So we're going to give, and we do this as a point score. So this is really a weighting to the signal. And so that's where we get, visiting the about page is worth 1 point, but downloading a crappy ebook is worth 10 points. Where does the 10 points come from? You pulled it out of thin air. You just made a complete guess. And, and then you start hoovering up all these signals, and you basically just add up how many data points you gathered, weighted out by, so every time someone downloads a crappy ebook, that's one extra data point, and then we'll do times 10. And then every time they visit the about page, that's one data point times 1, because that's the points for that. And then we just add up the points. We're adding up the pieces, the pieces of data that we gathered. And, and people recognize that there's a problem with this, that it's not working. And so what you see are kind of endless solutions to it, all of which actually make the problem worse, not better. And so typically they say, we just need different signals. We need better signals. We missed a bunch of these signals. If we had just captured all of the clicks in the right places, it would have been better. This is the argument that the AI hucksters are pushing, that what makes AI great is that it can catch all of these signals for your lead scoring system that you would have otherwise have missed, which actually makes the problem worse and makes it worse faster. You fail faster with this approach. The other issue is, well, we just need better points. We didn't quite have the points. Maybe, downloading a crappy ebook was really only worth 8 points, not 10. And maybe visiting the about page should have been worth 1.5 points. And so, there's this endless game of tweaking the points. And again, the solution is AI is this magical God up in the clouds. We'll just have God tell us what the point should be. We have no idea how the AI gods are guessing the points, but then again, we don't know how we guess them either. We just pull them out of thin air. And, so the problem is there's no rational understanding of why the system has failed. And if you don't know why something fails, you're highly unlikely to be able to figure out how to fix it and how to make it work. And the core problem here comes down to what I call data is not information. That what we're doing is we're gathering points of data and we're adding up how many data points we gathered. And again, we're weighting them. Some of these data points are more valuable to us than others. So, downloading that crappy ebook is 10 points for every event, for every data point. We'll multiply it by 10, where visiting the about page is only 1 point. But we're basically adding up how many data points we get. So, one question to step back and think about is, if you ask someone a question and they give you an answer, and then you ask them the same question 10 times and you get the same answer 10 times, you now have 10 data points, but do you have any more information? You don't. And this is the problem, is that data is not information. And typically, if we have a tiny amount of data, it can mean almost anything. If we have a lot of data, it gives us a high confidence that we know something. And adding more data on top of that doesn't mean we know it twice as hard or twice as much. We're simply slightly more confident that we have the one piece of information. So the example I give is, let's say you're running a SaaS company and you're selling software to accountants and you're doing classic content marketing. So you've got all of this content, all these articles on the site. If someone comes and downloads 10 articles this week, there's a pretty good likelihood that you're looking at an accountant and not a truck driver who just accidentally clicked on a link. So you've got a fairly good sense. But what happens if that same person downloads 50 articles or 100 articles? If they download 100 articles, are you 10 times more certain? You're not. You might be a couple of percentage points more certain, but you're already pretty certain after they downloaded 10. And so the idea is every additional data point delivers you less and less information. It makes you slightly more certain that you know a thing, but it doesn't tell you, having 10 times as many data points doesn't make you doesn't let you know 10 times as much information. Likewise, if someone just downloaded one article, what does that mean? It might mean that they're an accountant, or it might mean that, that they're, a truck driver who just had a question about accounting and accidentally found that article and is never going to come back. Or it might be, someone meant to click on this other link and the mouse slipped and they clicked on your link by accident. So, one data point tells you very, very little. But if that same person keeps coming back over and over again, you have a higher and higher certainty that, yes, this is someone that looks like we could sell to. But at some point, once you've seen them, read enough articles on your site, you pretty much know as much as you're going to know about whether or not this is a potential customer. And if they come back and read 10 times as many articles, you're not 10 times more certain that they're ready to buy. And so what happens is that, you get this very, this curve that sort of flattens out where you learn an enormous amount in the beginning as you get, once you get past one or two data points. But then once you get to a certain point, you know less and less and less net new information. And I'll show you an example of this. In a typical, so this is a very simple lead scoring system. So in a typical lead scoring system, this blue line is what your lead score looks like. If you have, if they've downloaded 20 ebooks or done, clicked on the same thing 20 times, your lead score is 20 times greater or 10 times greater than if they'd have done it twice. So what happens is that, you're just adding up how many data points without any thought as to what the data is telling you about the world. Where if you look at the amount of information that you're gathering, in the beginning, you're gathering information pretty fast, but then you reach a point to where, a lot more data points is just not going to tell you anything more beyond what you already pretty much knew. And so what happens is more and more ebook downloads is not going to keep telling you more and more information about how likely they are to be a good prospect. It's going to flatten out. And so what you see is the space in between the red line and the blue line that represents how many leads you're overestimating are sales ready. And so what you see is if we can magically gather a lot more data points, you're just making the problem worse faster. If you say, well, we need 10 times as many different signals, you're just making the process worse faster because you're still just naively adding up how many points of data we got. And again, this goes back to if you ask someone the same question 10 times and they give you the same answer 10 times in a row, you have 10 data points, but you have one piece of information. And the exact same thing is happening with the lead scoring. And the net effect here is that this system is guaranteed to massively overestimate how many leads are actually sales ready. No matter how perfect everything else is, no matter how perfect your choice of signals or how perfectly you can gather every signal in the out there, no matter how perfectly you can assign points to different signals, you've got a system that is guaranteed to absolutely massively overestimate how many leads are sales ready. And what you see here is a completely perfect explanation for why only 5 or 6% of MQLs are actually accepted by sales.
So that makes a ton of sense. I want to add in an extra kind of layer or dimension into this where there's one bucket where I think a significant and probably most of the accrued points that most leads get in marketing automation tools come from content engagement. But the more savvy lead scoring setups or the more savvy marketers setting them up would add in things like, did they visit the pricing page? Did they visit the case studies page? Giving them extra weight. And the argument they would make is that's information. That's another layer beyond they just read 10 ebooks. They read 5 ebooks and visited the pricing page. Surely that is more indicative of somebody who's actually considering buying us than someone who never visited that page. Obviously, it's all still in pursuit of the fundamental problem, which is that I'm trying to guess when you're ready. But where would that fall in this view for you?
I mean, this is a good point, is that different categories of signal provide you different pieces of information that can have different value and can tell you something slightly different. So in the same way, but you still have the same problem of if you're just simply adding everything together, what does this mean? So if you ask someone, how tall you are, and you ask them 10 times and they give you the same answer each time, and then you ask them, how much do you weigh 10 times, and they give you the same answer 10 times, you do not have 20 pieces of data. You have 2 pieces of data. You have 2 pieces of information. You have 20 pieces of data, 2 pieces of information. And so the problem still comes back to, what are we trying to know, and how do these individual pieces of information contribute to this? Now, in the example of how tall you are and how much you weigh, these are really kind of very independent things that don't quite tell you, really tell you fundamentally different. So, for instance, it would make no sense to add how tall they are with how much they weigh, and weighted by how important being tall is to you. So the obsession here, I think, is about just hoovering up lots of data points, and then just adding up all the data points. Each piece of data is going to tell you something. So for instance, if they've poured through your site and read 50 articles, and they visited your pricing page once, what does the visiting the pricing page mean? Does that mean they're ready to swipe a credit card? Maybe not. You don't know. Now if they visit the pricing page 5 times, or if 10 different people in the same company visit the pricing page 5 times, that's a pretty good indication that that maybe they're seriously looking at buying something from someone. But that's not how the lead scoring systems work. They take all these data points, they attach a weight to each one, and then they just dump it all in a bucket, and then they weigh the bucket. And once the bucket weighs 100, it's somehow magically ready, sales ready. And and so they toss it over to sales, and literally 95% of the time, sales says, "What the hell were you doing? These people are not in market. They're not buying. They're not looking at us." And the key point here, though, is that no matter how you choose your signals, how you weight the signals, or how you gather up the signals, the moment you start adding up your data points, you have a fundamentally failed system that will utterly, massively overestimate the likelihood that a lead is ready for sales, which is exactly what we've seen for 20 years.
Yeah. I want to go back to something you said earlier, because I think it's a really important point about the false positives, or sorry, the false negatives, I should say. Because I've definitely seen this, and I've experienced this firsthand, where there's nothing worse than you hand over your bucket of MQLs to the sales team. They tell you they're all junk, because they are. And then someone that you've labeled as a low quality, inactive lead shows up, asks for a demo, and then goes to buy. And the question is, how come that person wasn't on your radar? And usually you get sent back and go like, fix your scoring mechanism. Clearly you've done something wrong, and you just need to find a way of including those people in future. I guess, how big of a problem do you see it as from a false negative? Like, how many lost opportunities come because we focused on massive point accruing MQLs?
So actually, I have a very exact answer to that. because the deal is, there are completely fundamentally different approaches to scoring leads. And I have implemented these sorts of predictive statistical models now for 20 years. And I've seen this work in real life. And one of the things that I could see from the approaches that I've taken is we could actually measure both the false positive and the false negative rates. Because what we were looking at was, we had a predictive model, but then we were also, so we were scoring leads as they came through the system in real time. We're saving all of that serial data. But then we're also separately looking at which deals enter an active sales process and which ones become close won, close loss. And for us, the key was, did they enter an active sales process? Because that meant that real live human beings that were highly experienced and highly motivated to only talk to people who were actively in the process of buying had decided that these people were actively in the process of buying. So what we really used as the key event point was sales qualified. So, was this considered a sales qualified opportunity that the senior salespeople were willing to go with? And what we could see from this is, we could see all of the high scoring leads that ended up becoming sales ops. We could also see all the low scoring leads that ended up becoming sales ops, which were the false negatives. But we could also see all of the high scoring leads that never became sales ops, and all the low scoring leads that never became sales ops.
I'm on the edge of my seat. Tell me.
And so what we saw in this is that we had people who were ready to buy today, and people who were absolutely never going to buy anything we had to sell would behave in absolutely indistinguishable ways. So there was this whole category of people that I used to call click monkeys, that if they somehow found their way to your site, they would just click the crap out of everything. And so from, a traditional lead scoring mechanism, or even a more sophisticated mechanism, like what we were, these statistical predictive models that we were running, it was impossible to tell a click monkey from a serious buyer, because they would do all the things that a serious buyer would do. And so that meant that anytime we said, we predict that this person is likely to be sales ready, there was always a very good likelihood they weren't. But then at the same time, we had people who were not engaging at all, or very, very low engagement, that in fact turned out never to become a sales lead, or never to enter the sales process. But we also had people that had the same identical low level of engagement that would just drop out of the sky, ready to shove a check under our door at night. And one of the things that we would do, and this was 20 years ago when I was rolling these things out. And so, it was very puzzling, because at the time I was also fundamentally believing that, that engagement equals intent. And so this was sort of a shock for all of us to see these behaviors, see low engagement people that would just drop out of the sky ready to buy tomorrow. So we would consistently have the salespeople ask them, how did you decide to talk to us? And what you saw was, this was when we were selling biotech products. What we saw was, things like, I just came to this new lab, but I was I was working previously in Dr. So-and-so's lab, and we always bought this from you guys, or, we haven't bought this before. So I asked a colleague, a couple of labs down the hall, who they bought theirs from, and they suggested that you were the only one that we should talk to. And basically, the thing that suddenly got a name, 4 years ago, called dark social, that it's not that they're not engaging with information about your brand or your company or your product, is that you can't see it because they're not engaging digitally. But what we realized there was that you cannot use digital engagement to reliably predict whether or not someone is either ready for sales or will never be ready for sales. Now, going back to how likely these are, we could definitely predict at a much higher rate than just flipping a coin that someone was in fact ready for sales. So we could significantly outperform kind of a points-based lead scoring system with these models, if they were actually ready for sales. But there were big error bars there. We were even better at predicting that they weren't ready for market, but there were also big error bars, because there were still lots of people that looked like they were never going to buy who were actually ready to buy. But typically we were about twice as good at predicting that someone was ready to buy than we were at catching people that weren't ready to buy, and or catching people who are ready to buy but thinking that they weren't ready. So the false negative problem is actually a very big problem. It's a much harder one to solve. It's very hard to see, because it's like the dog that never barked. And and it was only because we were doing this full closed loop analysis on a real-time basis, where we're looking at the people who were actually coming into the sales process and then comparing it with the serial series of scores we had given them over the prior 9 to 12 months, as we saw them engage with the environment. So can you take this data and turn it into useful information? Absolutely. Can you do it using the traditional lead scoring process? Absolutely not. This is a completely, utterly, totally failed approach that for some reason has stuck around for 20 years now.
So the big question is obviously, if the fundamental lead scoring process is failed, what is the alternative?
Well, that's a hard question.
I guess let's start in a different place. So, what information are we looking for, if not data?
So everything's data. I mean, our only knowledge of the outside world, unless you're physically in the room watching someone's finger press down on the mouse button, the only way you know that mouse click occurred is you gathered a piece of data. So essentially, all of our knowledge of the outside world is going to come to us through data in the form that we can capture that data. So the question then is twofold. One is, how much information is in the data? And the thing I always like to say is that data is not information. Data is the bucket that information came in. And that bucket might or might not contain, some level of information. It might contain no information, it might contain a lot of information, or it might contain just a little bit of information. But just because you have a lot of buckets doesn't mean you have a lot of information. You can have a lot of empty buckets and they're still not holding anything, even though you got a lot of buckets. Or you can have a small number of full buckets that are holding a lot. And so, the first question is, what information can we extract? And it's not just information, because we're not adding up information in the way that we're adding up data. It's how much net new information. But then the second and the deeper question is, what do we want the information to tell us? And the answer to that is, any kind of a lead scoring system is essentially a prediction about the future. And so you would like to know, if we take this lead and we do a certain thing to it, put it into the sales process, what is the probability that taking that action will lead to a closed won versus a closed loss? And so what we have to do is we have to understand what pieces of information allow us to reliably put that lead into two buckets: win bucket, a lose bucket. And so this is the other flaw that you see with a lot of like machine learning, RevOps sort of failed attempts to try to score leads is, and you read these articles and they always start with the same thing. We take all of our list of closed ones and we put them into this machine learning system, which will tell us, what makes them a closed won. That does not tell you what makes them a closed won. And the problem is that just because there's something that characterizes all of the closed ones doesn't mean that same thing doesn't also characterize all the closed losses. So if you say something like 31% of the time, they visited our LinkedIn company page, it's like, okay, that's fine. So tell me how often the people that didn't become buyers visited your LinkedIn company page. Well, they also visited it 31% of the time. It's like, okay, so that doesn't really tell me anything. There's no net new information, because again, we're making, it's kind of like the Harry Potter sorting hat. We would like to know, we would like to know something about the future in terms of, we've got a person, which bucket are they going to fall into? And, and then if we then play time forward, did they actually fall into that bucket often enough that the scoring could be considered better than flipping a coin? Because again, one way to decide whether or not a lead is going to be closed won or closed loss is take the lead, flip a coin. If it's heads, we put them in the win bucket, and if it's tails, we put them in the loss bucket. And that's how we score our leads. That would probably work about as good as what we're doing right now. But in fact, it might actually improve things. But it's so. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think there's a really important point there, because I want to go back to what you had said over the last few weeks about thinking in bets, because I think, especially when it comes to MQLs, a lot of what we're saying with MQL lead scoring is not, this lead is more likely to be a good lead than this lead. What we're actually saying is, this lead's ready, and these leads are not quite ready, but I'll tell you when they're ready, which is a very arrogant belief about what we're capable of doing. And I think you also made the really important point before, that for as much information as we have, the amount of information that we have of the total information that is out there is minuscule. Like, we might have hundreds of data points on a person that we've aggregated, but we have no ability to know who they've talked to, what's been said to them, whether they've bought before. Like, all of the really important things that make the bigger difference are invisible to us. And so we're making bets. We're not even making bets. We're making arrogant predictions that we can time it perfectly with a tiny sliver of digital only information. as opposed to what it sounds like you're advocating far more for, which is this is where you should spend your time. I'm not saying these are the only leads who are ready. There are others that might come in and we have no idea because we can't see things that exist out there. But I would spend my time here rather than spend my time over there, as opposed to ignore every other lead but these, because these are the ones that are ready.
Right. And that's this notion of deterministic thinking, that everything is probabilities, everything is thinking in bets. But here's another thing to keep in mind. Just as there is some sort of lead scoring system. Now, again, even when you toss it over to sales and they start having conversations, they have their own scoring system. Sales does. It might be MEDDIC, it might be, BANT, it could be but they're looking, they are having conversations and they're peppering the conversations with questions where they're trying to get more and more information. So they're scoring it as well. But what people don't appreciate is that the buyer is also scoring the vendor. And the buyer is scoring the vendor with signals. So a signal might be what they read on G2, a review they read from one of your angry customers, reading 10 articles on your site. But what it also could be is their own personal lived experience at a different company, talking to a trusted colleague. And the deal is there's an overlap between a portion of what the buyer is doing to score the vendor can be seen by the vendor to score the buyer, but only a small overlap. Much of the information, and again, the buyer is, when the buyer reads your product page full of fluff, they're going to give that, a very low score, 1. When they talk to a trusted colleague who's, used the product, they're going to give that a very high score, 20. And so they're scoring, they're attaching relative weights to different pieces of information based on whether or not they think is believable. And the problem is that the highest weighted scoring is going to be all the stuff you can never see because it's not digital, because what they saw with their own eyeballs when they used the product at the prior company, that's enormous. What a trusted colleague recommended to them or recommended them not to get near, highly important. You can't see that. The low important things is, did they visit your pricing page? Because your pricing is probably about like everybody else's pricing, which means that there's essentially no net new information for them, if they're using pricing as a mechanism. So why should visiting the pricing page be that important to you? And, as the vendor. So the thing to keep in mind is there's a parallel universe, mostly living on the other side of a black hole that you cannot see, that's scoring you. And the question is, how good's the overlap between your scoring and their scoring? How many common pieces of, how many common signals can you each, are you actually sharing? And the answer to that is probably very low. So there is another alternative mechanism. So the other question is, the thing that people are often trying to, think that they're trying to extract from all of these signals is really 2 questions. Is this somebody who is likely to buy a thing that looks like what we're selling? So are they in the ICP? Or is, what was the term that Mark Ritson kept calling it?
Oh, the ideal customer portrait.
Portrait, yes. Yeah, this is somebody who clearly doesn't know B2B or even really the practice of actually doing marketing down in the trenches. The thing I always say about these kind of academics are that they're rather like the harem eunuchs. They're really anxious to tell you all about how it's done, even though they've never actually done it themselves. Yeah, so part of what you're trying to do is, are they in their ICP, which is shorthand for, are they likely to buy a thing that looks like the thing we're selling? And then the second thing is, do they have intent? Meaning, are they likely to be, ready to buy right now? But the problem here is that clearly intent is very hard to measure. Anybody who's ever had a Bombora or a 6th Sense account knows that those guys certainly can't measure intent. And we're even less likely because we got a lot less resources than they do. The other issue is, are they in our ICP? The problem there is, just because they're willing to buy from someone who looks like us doesn't mean they're willing to buy, or I'm sorry, just because they are willing, they're prepared to buy a thing that looks like the thing we sell, doesn't mean that they're prepared to buy from us. And even if they are prepared to buy from us, it doesn't say anything about whether we are capable of selling to them. And so you see this widely in B2B. So you'll see two identical companies with essentially identical products. And one of these companies is selling, say, heavily into government and healthcare accounts. Another one is selling heavily into industrials and manufacturing. What's the difference here? It's not the product. It's not the fact that one company is bigger or smaller than the other company. It's that one of these two companies has gotten really good at selling into places that have complex bureaucratic procurement processes, like government and healthcare. Another one is good, for selling into, old school industrial and manufacturing facilities. And, so how likely that lead is to land in the closed one bucket has a lot to do with who you are as the seller. But it also has a lot to do with your product. Because again, if you've got a CRM that's HIPAA compliant and no one else does, you're going to get a lot of interest from, people in healthcare. And so again, there can be points of differentiation that will make someone have a higher probability of buying from you. Still doesn't mean that they'll buy from you, but it means that there's simply a higher probability. And so again, it goes back to this thinking in bets. If I'm holding certain cards, I know if I'm a good poker player, I know that I've got a higher chance of winning this hand, and it's worth raising, versus if I hold other hands, I could still win, but I've got a higher chance of losing, and I should probably fold. And so this is really what a lead scoring system should do, is it should give you a sense of how good is the hand I'm holding based on the information I have available. Because again, that poker player doesn't know what cards are being held by the other people at the table. They don't know what cards are in the deck. They don't know what's on top of the deck. So there's all this information that is, that's sort of like, your potential buyer, calling up a colleague and asking what they use. You'll never know that this occurred. It'll be invisible to you. So, that can't be a part of what you're doing. So you have to take incomplete information and make essentially a probabilistic decision as to, do I have a higher or lower likelihood of getting a good outcome if we invest? And the other part in here that's important is, just because the buyer is prepared to buy a thing that looks like what we sell does not mean they're prepared to buy it from you. And, one of the things we see in B2B is that large enterprise companies tend to strongly prefer to buy from other large enterprise companies like Microsoft, Oracle, Salesforce, SAP, or failing that, they prefer to buy from the market leader because it's a safe purchase. This has nothing, and that part has nothing to do with your sales team, with your product, with your points of differentiation. So there's a lot of these factors that are really tied to who you are, what your product is, as to whether or not they're likely to buy from you, beyond the fact that they're merely in your ICP. So again, if you're selling to accountants and someone's read 20 articles on your site, you have a high likelihood that this is an accountant. Doesn't mean that it's an accountant who's prepared to buy, their accounting software from you, because likely they're going to go and they're going to buy it from either Microsoft or SAP, because that's who controls 90% of the market. Doesn't matter how good your stuff is. And so what you have to figure out is, who is likely not just to buy, but to buy from us? Who are we good at selling to? And then how likely are we going to get a win, given the fact that we don't really know whether they're in market or not, or we don't have a good, we don't have a high probability sense of whether or not they're in market. How do we put all of this into, a single score that will give us, that poker player's intuition that this is a hand good enough to raise versus this is a hand that I should probably just fold?
That's fascinating. You remind me of this story. When I was in school and in college, I worked in retail sales in a camera store. I've been a camera nut forever. I spent like 6 years selling cameras. And what's funny is, you mentioned those click monkeys earlier. When you're working in any type of a, be it hi-fis, records, cameras, any kind of tech toy, you learn very quickly that there are people who will come in every single week to play with the toy and then never ever buy it.
Yeah,
And yet,
imagine running a Warhammer 40,000 store.
yeah, they love to come in, and yet they're the least likely ones to buy. Similarly, when you worked in a specialty store like a camera store, there were people who would come in and all they would ask you about is the price, and you knew that they were going to buy from the big box store who was selling it as a loss leader item straight away. And so coming in and asking price was not actually a very good indicator of somebody being ready to buy. And you pick those things up really quickly when you're talking to human beings. And yet you fast forward 15 years later, and I was working in house, and I remember looking at the lead scoring results, and I would look at who the highest engaged leads were, and I would be scratching my head going like, these people, why are they reading like 500 blog posts over the last 2 years and they've never come close to buying? And instead of ever questioning, maybe more doesn't necessarily mean better, I never questioned whether or not the underlying system was the problem.
So one of the things we're leading up to is a radically different way to think about leads and think about lead scoring and think about how you go about estimating these probabilities. And again, no scoring system will ever be perfect because we will be permanently missing information. Again, think about, that buyer is scoring the vendors. Their scoring system looks very different than ours because they have access to really important information that we can't see. And so, the idea is, given what the cards you're holding in your hand, you don't know what everyone else at the table is holding. You don't know what's on the deck. But given what you can see, how do you come up with the best estimate of whether, we should take this lead and, raise or fold? Send it to sales or leave it over here in marketing for now. And there are very specific ways of doing this. And this is what we're kind of slowly leading toward. But next week, we're going to take a little bit of an interesting diversion that may not obviously seem like it's tied to MQLs and scoring, but it very, very much is. And that's the notion that rising and falling markets break the 95-5 rule. And it doesn't break it by a little bit. It breaks it massively. So if you are in a rapidly growing category, you have a very different version of the 95-5 rule. And, and one of the things that's going to tell you is that, so one question is, if we know nothing about these leads other than they're in our ICP, our ideal customer portrait. So, if all you know is they're in our ICP, we know nothing about whether or not they're in market. If we just randomly pluck one of those leads, what's the probability they'll be in market? It turns out that in a completely static market, that probability is around 5%. So you've got roughly a 95% chance that they're not ready to be sold to, which, not unsurprisingly, is what the Gartner benchmark says the acceptance rate is of MQLs by the sales team. But if that lead is in a market that's rapidly growing, then there might be a 20% probability. It might be significantly greater probability that they're in market simply because of the underlying growth of the category. And so this notion of, do you have rising or falling markets? What does that give you in terms of additional information about the likelihood that this lead is ready to buy now? And that's a very important piece of information, and coupled with this notion that rising and falling markets break the 95-5 rule. And this is not something people are talking about, and they should be talking about it. And there's some massive failure of imagination and some massive misconceptions about the 95-5 rule that are out there, that because the 95-5 rule is built on this assumption that markets are absolutely stationary, meaning they're not growing, they're not shrinking, no customers are exiting the market, and no customers are coming into the market or into the category. That it looks like laundry detergent. Every box of laundry detergent that gets pulled off a shelf in a supermarket is being bought to replace an empty box back in someone's house. And so, there's a difference between markets that are replacement only versus markets that are a combination of replacement plus new entrants. And it's those new entrants that make it a growing market that break the 95-5 rule. And that's what we're going to talk about next week.
I'm very excited about this one, and I've got data to come with this one as well.
Great.
As always, this is a pleasure. The numbers are humblingly high to these events. So let us keep this rolling.
Absolutely. And we will see everyone next week.
Yeah, bye-bye.